Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Saving Lives is Not Enough webinar. My name is Jill Paterson. I'm a partner at Leigh, who specialises in cases relating to those who have been affected by fire. I'm delighted to host what promises to be an incredibly interesting discussion this afternoon about the future of burns care. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our panel. First, we have Kristina Stiles. Chrissy is an orthoplastic clinical nurse specialist at an NHS trust. She's the author of The Family Oops and Burns First Aid and is co-author of the Saving Lives report that we're going to discuss today. Next, we have David Wales. David had a distinguished career in the Fire and Rescue Service and is also co-author of the Saving Lives report. Johanne Harrison is Head of Patient Services at the Katy Foundation. She's a qualified psychotherapist and has over 20 years of experience in supporting adults and children within social care and the charitable sector. Finally, we're really honoured to be joined by Danielle Branch, who is the expert of experts here, as she's experienced burns care and rehab itself following a fire that left her with 90% of her body wounded. Danielle went on to contribute to the co-design of the Katy Foundation Rehabilitation Centre. Thank you so much to all our panellists for joining us this afternoon. Let's get started with a bit of a discussion about the Saving Lives is Not Enough report itself. Good afternoon, Chrissy and David. Would you, hello. Would you be able to just kick us off with a bit of discussion about how the report came about and what the main issues were that you hope to tackle with it?
So the story, I suppose, began in 2012 when both myself and David were separately attending International Burn Society meeting, where there were thousands of delegates from international burn services, and I came to it as a delegate to just take part, watch the presentations, and my role at the time was as the burn care advisor, very much involved with the pre-hospital community, educating paramedics, fire services, and emergency departments on the pre-burn centre care of the severely burn injured individuals. And this is where I saw the only firefighter in the event present, and that was David.
Thank you, Chrissy. And I guess my story for this started about 3 years earlier. I was heading up the fire investigation and research team for Kent Fire Service at the time. And we had a question about why the public didn't behave as we expected to, or as we advised them to when we attended fires. And so we've been looking at really that bit with a view that if we understood that better, we could perhaps get them to comply with our guidance. And what became really quickly apparent to me when I started interviewing people who'd experienced fires was that it's very different, their human and lived experience as a member of the public, rather than it was as myself as a professional. And I became very interested in following the burn survivor journey particularly. And as Chrissy said, I arrived at the conference, 1,000 international delegates from the burns teams. I was absolutely blown away by the passion and the expertise and the care they had for their survivors. But I also looked and thought, why are we not talking? There's literally, as Chrissy said, just myself and a colleague from the fire service. And it made me realise that if we're not speaking to each other, how can we make sure that we're aligning our practices to get the best outcome for the survivor? And so that began a conversation with Chrissy that obviously culminated in the report.
From our point of view is that the fire service are one of the very first services that attend our most severely injured patients. So in discussion with David and after his presentation on human behaviour and fires, we saw a common purpose that actually those most injured individuals, we could improve the care way before they get to us in the burn service.
So you collaborated to produce this amazing report, which many people might not have had the chance to read yet. And after this webinar, when we send around the recording, we'll send a link to the report as well. Would you be able to just summarise for us some of what your findings were?
Certainly. I think one of the things that struck me, and hence the title of the report, was actually we had different aspirations. And again, that comes back to the conference I attended with Chrissy. What I heard from the burns community was the desire to return people to pre-event condition, aesthetically, emotionally, and actually allow them to resume their lives as best they possibly could as they were able to beforehand. And really, we were looking at saving lives. So our job was to get people out of a building and pass care on to somebody else. And so I think from that very start, you realise that if the aspirations aren't the same, if our understanding of what is possible in terms of outcomes isn't the same, we need to do more to make that better. So there was a number of things in terms of the way we design services, and I'm sure we'll discuss that later, but in practical terms, that sense of the earlier the intervention, the better. And what we found often was a natural desire to get people away from the scene and into a place of care. And that's entirely reasonable, and it makes sense in one level. But then when you start really looking at it in detail, you think we're missing opportunities. And one of the things that Chrissy said that really struck me early on was survivors are reaching her 8 hours later. And that's really when the care starts. All the way before that, we had opportunities to apply water. So what we wanted to do is shift the mindset and really break it down, because in the fire service, we were concerned with attendance time. But when I sort of said, okay, that has actually increased over the last 25 years by 50%. It's not a measure of outcome. What happens when we arrive? Where in the country am I going to get the best likelihood to be rescued quickly, get the best survival outcomes? I can't find that data. So we really wanted to break it down. And actually what you'll see in the report is a journey as seen through effectively from the survivor. So at each point, we could think differently. So for example, we could think protect on contact. When I went into a building that had smoke, heat, or other contaminants, I was protected. I wore breathing apparatus, I wore equipment to ensure I wasn't harmed. And yet when I found a casualty, I would bring them out through that very environment in the condition I found them. And I think when you start to look at it in that sense, why are we not geared up to protect on contact? Why are we not doing things earlier on? And so it's a mindset shift. And then the reports, we discuss some very practical things to say, if we think about this differently, we start to see different opportunities to improve the outcome for people.
From a burn service point of view, one of the things that we very quickly became aware of is that possibly 50, 60 years ago, saving a life was the best that we could do for the burn survivors. But actually, in the last many decades, the priority switched to the quality of life. And what the quote that Professor Wood has suggested is that the quality of life must be worth the pain of survival for those people that we look after. And this is the key message within the report as well.
That's really striking. So one of the things that you highlight, Chrissy, in a lot of the work that you do is spreading the word about the importance of that initial treatment. And I was wondering whether you could tell us more about what the recommended initial treatment is for a burns injury and what a difference that can make to the life of a survivor of burns.
So burn injury obviously causes heat or chemical component damage to skin, and skin is our largest organ in the body, and the initial measures like first aid are key to reversing the damage or lessening the damage to our skin, to our largest organ. So first aid is quite often not delivered at the time of injury, and we find that about a third of all of our patients arrive not having had a first aid. So, and in fact, in children, it's even worse. It's 1 in 4 children who attend the burn services not had first aid before coming to us. So first aid is simple intervention that a non-healthcare professional is more than capable to deliver. It could be a parent, a guardian, a grandparent, a teacher, anybody who is with that person at the time could do first aid. Lots of inappropriate measures happen, but actually the latest guidance is 20 minutes of tepid running water within 3 hours of injury is really effective for reversing the damage. It means that the burn wound doesn't progress, it doesn't change over time to become deeper and bigger. If it changes in that way, it's a negative progression, which might mean the person might require surgery, a skin graft operation, and possibly not even one, it also will mean that that person is more likely to heal with a scar. And once the wound is healed, those scars start to grow, and scars continue to grow for at least 2 years after the burn injury is healed. And it takes a lot more ongoing treatment to manage to flatten the scars, to return the flexibility, movement that's affected by the scarring. So first aid is simple, free way that we can all impact the outcome for burn survivors. And you don't need to be trained in it. And it's so simple, so easy to do, and yet often isn't done because of trauma and stress at the time. That's kind of the message, isn't it? Is trying to recover the quality of life for those burn survivors.
And knowing what to do, which is great about a lot of the seminars that you do. It's just simple things that if you're armed with it before the event happens, then you might know what to do automatically when it does. And that 3-hour window as well is really important, I think, because I think most people think, you know, you've probably got 20 minutes to do that, not realizing that 3 hours it's actually quite a big point of time to get in there and do it.
Absolutely. And 20 minutes is a long time, especially if, in case of children, you know, they get very distressed, you're distressed with them. To last 20 minutes of cooling, it will feel like a lifetime. And certainly for yourself, you know, again, it's a long time. It also means that if you're delivering first aid or first aid wasn't done, it's really important to pass it on to the next service who attends. So say a fire service arrives, they have capacity to do it because that 3-hour clock is ticking. If they don't do it, okay, paramedics arrive, they have capacity to do it. And yet only 25% of our patients attended by paramedics have first aid. Okay, so when they get to emergency department, maybe then first aid will be delivered. We're still within that 3-hour window. And yet only 50% of patients who go through emergency departments get given first aid. By the time they're with us in the burn service, 6 hours later, it's too late. So we've missed that window of opportunity. It's so key that you're aware that this is something you're capable of doing.
And something so simple, it's mad really that it doesn't happen. Let's move back to David. David, you talk quite a lot about a customer focused approach. Would you be able to explain a little bit more to us about what you mean about that in terms of this context?
Of course. I mentioned the human behaviour study we did, and one of the things that we found was really that the disconnect between myself as a professional and a member of the public is quite vast. I'd been a firefighter for 20 years. I'd met lots of people that experienced fires, but always on my terms. I'd always ask them the questions that were important to me to complete a form or for my knowledge. And when we started to study, we interviewed 10 people that had minor fires, minor injuries, and just said, okay, your story, your words. And having heard after about the third one, it's a completely different experience. Of course, it's very emotional. There's lots of thoughts and considerations that go through the public's mind that never occurred to me. And there are lots of considerations. And so actually hearing that, there's a real disconnect. And actually you start then think, so who's a customer? As a public body, we have funding agency, we have regulations, we have lots of things around us and management controls. All of these have a visible ability to influence our service, and it's easy to see them as a customer. The public aren't as well represented. So if you don't have really, really deep understanding of what their experience is, you conform to what the regulations say, you conform to what management feel is most appropriate. All well-intentioned, but missing the point of the experience for the public. And because it's not connected, as we say, we're not talking to the other agencies, we all deliver our service against our regulations as we see it. The survivor gets the sum of the parts. They get the things that everyone does to them, and nobody owns or sees the end-to-end experience other than the survivor themselves. And we wanted to introduce the idea of language matters. So, for example, we talk about survivors here. We'll still be talking about victims and other things like that at the scene. So we need to understand and join up. It's really simple, some of this. But what occurred to me as we looked at, so how do we bridge that disconnect, is this isn't a unique problem. The commercial world are brilliant at this. They know that actually a phone largely now is a phone. most of us don't really look at the technical specification, but you'll have a fondness for particular types of brands because of the way they make you feel. And there's a great quote by Angela Mayu, is people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they will never forget how they made you feel. And I think actually, if you relate that to your own experience in most places, it's true, that's the memory you hold for a long time. So the customer experience mindset was really to go into the commercial world and say, look, these people are doing this really well. That keeps their business going. How do they know what their customer feels? How do they know when you get the phone call that says, we really value you, an hour later, we really value you? It's this disconnect. And so I think it was going into that world to say, what can we learn? How do we bring that into it to make it more complete? What we do is necessary. We've got to put fires out. We've got to do those things, but we could do it better. And one of the key things for us was that journey map of saying, if we look end to end for the survivor, what does that start to look like? Where are the gaps? Where's the duplications? Where's the bits where we won't, for fear of something else, we won't tell the relatives anything about somebody they care for? How are we, what's that feel like as a lived or human experience? Not a process to follow, not a technical, we got this out, we did that well, I followed my training scheme. What does it feel like as a human to experience that care? And are we honestly knowing that we can do the best for them? So the customer experience thing, as I say, it's well established in the commercial world. We'll know all our favorite brands, and often that's because how they make us feel rather than the products they offer. And it was an attempt to really bring that in and understand the distinction between where, I suppose, automated matters, but where people really, really need the human intervention. And so there's lots we can learn from customer experience, and that's really what we try to bring in, to remind people we're not here for regulations, we're here for the public, because they're our friends and family, and it really comes down to how would you want them treated.
Thank you. So on that note, that's probably a really great place to bring you in, Danielle. Your story, your words, please. Would you be able to tell us a bit about what happened to you?
Yeah, so my parents own a motorhome, and we went away for New Year's Eve in 2015, going into 16, and basically went to bed, and then New Year's Eve morning got woken up to the motorhome being on fire. I woke up, my whole body was alight. My parents were at the other end of the motorhome. Myself and my stepdad woke up at the same time and screamed about the fire. He opened the door, and obviously the oxygen fed the fire, so it became worse, and he got blown out and was knocked unconscious to the floor. One of their dogs went over his head and got out. My mum was sitting in her bed, like sat bolt upright, and just shock on her face. And after speaking to her after the fire, basically said, you know, in my head, I was safe where I was. There was no fire, and she had to get out of bed and walk through the fire to get out. I was standing there alight, and basically was screaming at her to get out. So she got up and got out, and then as I came out, it was stones outside, so I literally just dropped to the floor and rolled. Basically, cut a long story short, we then went to a field at the back of the clubhouse of where we were, and I just remember my clothes had burnt into me. My body didn't actually feel that painful. It was more my feet. I felt the soles of my feet were like flip-flops, so it's like excruciating pain. But my clothes had burnt into my skin, and I was sitting, obviously being December, it was freezing cold at like 8:20 in the morning, I think the fire started, sitting outside in the grass, and everyone was advised not to put anything on me because obviously it was stick. So I was literally just sat on the grass, freezing cold. I have recollection of the fire brigade arriving, and they were putting the fire out, and no one came over to see, you know, how we were, if everything was okay. But as far as I was aware, their job was to put the fire out. You know, I wasn't aware that they had any training to basically assist in the first aid side of things. From that, the ambulance turned up, I think it was about 15-20 minutes after the fire brigade arrived. They were asking me questions, and I remember them saying to me they were calling an air ambulance to come and get me. And I just remember thinking, this is the most ridiculous thing ever. I've burnt my feet. Like, I don't need, just put them on ice, you know, this is crazy. Obviously I was more concerned about where my mum was, because she was kept away from me at the other side of the field. And I remember looking down at myself, and everything just like expanding, and I just thought, oh my god, it's just shock, I'm just hallucinating or something. But basically what happened, where I burnt the whole circumference, there was no pressure for it to release, so it was just expanding. I was then put out and taken by air ambulance to St George's Hospital in London, and then I was taken by ambulance, so I wasn't treated there. I was then taken by ambulance from there to Chelsea and Westminster, and that's where I was treated for my burns. And just reflecting back on what Chrissy was saying earlier, the different stages of how many places and people had actually seen me, I wasn't actually treated until I arrived at Chelsea and Westminster. So no first aid, as far as I'm aware of what I've been told, was actually done for me until arriving there. So I was then put into an induced coma, which I was in an induced coma for 8 weeks. And then from there, I stayed at Chelsea and Westminster in ICU for a further 4 weeks after that. And then I was transferred to East Grinstead, Queen Victoria Hospital. And during my time at Chelsea and Westminster and East Grinstead, I had over 200 hours of surgery. So,
wow. So you went through an awful lot. And are you able to tell us a bit about how you got involved with the Katy Piper Foundation after that?
Yes, yeah. So basically, I'm not sure exactly who it was. There was a third-party company that was involved with the insurance for my parents, and she contacted the Katy Piper Foundation, and a lot of friends and family were contacting them as well at the time when I was in hospital. And they said, you know, we can't do anything at the moment, wait until she's like kind of out home and things like that. So when I was out at home, I felt really deflated. Like I'd already gone through a lot of trauma previously, where I'd lost my husband. So you know, my husband had passed away, so I was trying to deal with that, as well as everything's changed. And I think I've relied quite a lot on how I looked and things, and took it for granted. So it was, for me, such a massive change, and everything got taken away from me. I couldn't eat, I couldn't talk, I couldn't walk properly. I had to learn to do everything again, because being in an induced coma for so long, my muscles had just wasted away. So for me, I had to learn to do everything, and all my independence had gone. So basically, I went back to my parents' house when I was released from hospital, and Katy Piper and one of the members of staff, Azina, basically came out to visit me at home. I remember looking at Katy, and she had just done a thing on TV, so she had all her hair and makeup done, and she apologised that she was all done up. And I'm sitting there thinking, can't even put a bra on, it was so painful. And there's like Katy all done up and everything. And I just thought, it's lovely how well she's done, but that's not my life. you know, that's never going to be my life. And I just felt really deflated with everything. I was then invited, which was a couple of weeks later after meeting them, to come to go on a weekender for burn survivors, which the charity hosts and pays for and everything. They get all funding for it, which was absolutely amazing. I cannot tell you how that changed my life that weekend. I literally was just blown away by survivors and their attitude of how, like, your life's not over because you're burnt. You know, there is life after burns, and just how much inspiration these like other women and men gave me of actually life does go on. And I made some friends that I'm still friends with now, you know, and it's just like you understand each other from the word go, and it's an instant connection. And yeah, so I basically went on that. So then I got involved. So after that, I was just determined to basically help raise money for the foundation, because for me, that weekend saved my life, because I didn't want to be here before that. So that just gave me everything. So I then did some fundraising. I did a masked ball, I did a skydive, petrified heights. Why I did it, I'm not sure. But yeah, and raised over £20,000 for the charity. And then they were opening a scar rehab centre, and I went on the pilot of it. And whilst I was there, one of the physios suggested me coming on board, basically working up there and helping other patients and things do things. So I basically, it was all in talks and things, and I was doing some work in the London office with them, and then I packed my bags and relocated up north to Liverpool, and basically helped open the rehab centre, and basically just did that. And then I left there just over a year and a half ago now, as I basically adopted. So I left to become a mum.
That's wonderful, and I'll ask you a little bit more about that at the end. This is probably a good point to turn to the lovely Johanne, who works with survivors of burns every day. Thanks so much for joining us, Johanne. Obviously, there's quite a sort of psychological trauma side to all of this, which people aren't often aware of. And I was wondering whether you could talk to us about that, and also what therapies and services the Katy Piper Foundation offers to people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think when people think of the psychological impact on patients, they're thinking about the actual event and when it took place and how difficult it must have been for a patient to process what was going on. But for many patients, the situation is so extreme at the time of their injury that they're either completely overwhelmed, they're in shock, they may be unconscious, they may have been given medication. So for many people, that's not the time that the psychological impact hits them, because then they're whisked off to hospital, all consuming. And for many patients with a large burn injury, for them, they're just trying to get through hour by hour. And as Danielle said, you know, she was put into a coma for 2 months. Then people wake up, and only really when their life starts to progress to the future and they start to think about the future, that's when the psychological effects usually kick in for people, when they start to think about what happened, who was there, what's going to happen to me now, what am I going to do? Because whilst they're in hospital, there is that element of there's a lot going on. But then for patients, they're looking to their nearest and dearest and family and friends to try and fill some of the missing gaps about what happened on that night. You know, who was there? was I taken out of the house? Did I get out myself? You know, and often that information isn't communicated to patients, and they find themselves in absolute turmoil trying to piece together the biggest event that's happened to them in their life, and nobody has the answers. So as David had said before about communication, it's absolutely crucial. If there was one way, I think, to help people, it would be to have that consistency, so that there's some kind of follow on, like Chrissy said, the first responders, the first people that go there, you know, that something follows the patient. So when they're ready, that information is there. So, you know, it's really important information, because the traumatic event, you know, there's often onlookers, there's more than just the patient that's affected by that. You know, there's the services, there's the public, family members, and all that has played a key part in that person's life, but then nobody's able to share that information. So I think for us, you know, that's the one thing that patients consistently talk about, not being able to put the pieces together. Again, at the rehabilitation service that we set up, and Danielle was a key part of that. One of the things, because Katy, with her own rehabilitation, which was 11 years ago when she set up the charity, she had to go to France to be able to access burns care, because there wasn't anything in the UK. And sort of the driver behind setting up the charity was to ensure that survivors of burns are able to access that rehabilitation to help them to become independent and live their life to the best of their ability, where they're setting their own goals and they're deciding how their future is going to be. So the charity now has, it was residential initially when we set up the programme. So patients would come to St Helens, where we have 2 residential bungalows that are in the grounds of a beautiful hospital. And they would be an individual tailored programme for that patient would be set up. And so there'd be a combination of psychological support, physio, and physical strengthening and confidence building. And there'd be an awful lot of input. And quite often we had 2 patients coming together so they could support each other and spur each other on, because this is no walk in the park. This is not like going to a spa. This is more like a boot camp, you know, with people grinning and bearing and pushing themselves. So, you know, it's been an amazing process. And then, of course, with COVID hitting the country, and we had to suspend that just over 12 months ago, and we switched our services to a remote service, because what we were really conscious of is that for many patients, they weren't able to go to their follow-up appointments at hospital. You know, community services weren't available. So we wanted to respond as quickly as we could to be able to bridge the gap that the NHS were experiencing, because staff were redeployed and things, you know, were being moved around. So we then developed a remote program so that patients have, again, a tailored program specific to their individual needs, working very much in conjunction with their burn services and other community services involved, where we're providing psychological support, again, physio, going through instructions and supporting family members to be able to do scar massage, something that they were unclear about. How do I do this? What's the best way? With a burns physio on the other end of a call like this. And then we've got personal trainers, dietitians, you know, yoga, meditation, and groups where patients can come together again, so they can share in their experience and they can share in the journey.
It's an incredible service. I've had the benefit of coming up to look at the centre myself, and I was blown away by what you're able to offer. So we'll move back to the report, the Saving Lives is Not Enough report. Chrissy and or David, would one of you be able to tell us how things have developed since you published the report?
Of course. If I can just pick up as well on a point that Joanne made about the communication and just re-emphasise, I think one of the things that Chris and I discussed was, as professionals, we train for this. We've chosen this as a career. We willingly go to work. We want to use our skills and expertise, and to an extent, we want the opportunity to do that. At the end of the day, we go home, we can leave it behind, and we have fantastic support in all the services for those incidents that affect us. But for members of the public, it's unexpected, it's unwanted, it doesn't stop at 6 o'clock when we go off duty, and it's unfamiliar. It's not signposted, and I think as Danielle mentioned, you haven't got that sense of what comes next. You don't know what you need, you don't know what's available. And I think just to really emphasise the fact that as professionals, coming back to the earlier point about customer experience, you have one event, but you can have multiple experiences of it. Ours is one important one, it's not the only one. And unless we really understand on that human level, we will collect information, but we won't answer the questions that Johanne or Danielle have, because it hasn't occurred to us to ask what happened, who did that, and was a move, because it is a more human version. So sorry, just to go back to that, but I think it's such an important point that as professionals, we have to actively listen to the voices of the people we serve. We cannot assume it, otherwise we're going to leave gaps. But to your point, the report we first wrote in 2017, published it locally for Kent and some others to see. There was some interest, and there was some development work. For Kent, as far as I understand, there was some prevention work that picked up out of it, having highlighted burns, and I'm sure Chrissy will cover that. And some, I guess, a little bit of work around schools. One of the most useful ones, and the ones we was really pleased to see, was attending schools only. So where ambulances couldn't deploy quickly, we know it's not life-threatening, but it is life-changing. And we heard some great stories of where Kent then sent an appliance to help people apply water in that early stage. So that's really good, because that's looking at what the customer needs, not what we do from an agency point of view. And so who's best placed to go is the one that's able to. So there were some really good things, but in truth, it didn't develop as a piece of work in the way that is presented in the report. We published it formally in 2019 and did a lot of promotional work around that. And it hasn't really been picked up, and we had great support from the British Burn Association, who've been fantastic. And if you look in the report, we've had a number of people that have really helped us put all this together and work through it. But obviously a lot of the report recommendations are aimed at the fire service. We took it through the National Fire Chiefs Council, and it was considered by their operations committee last November, and we were told that it was supported. But in truth, unfortunately, we haven't heard any more as to what that means. We haven't been able to use their endorsement on it. We haven't had it put forward for national, at least discussion or adoption into policy. It's attracted a lot of interest for the way we've gone about the work, and I think it comes back. So organisations like the Bennett Institute for Public Policy, Public Sector Transformation Academy have been very complimentary and supportive of the way we approach the service design and the ethos behind it, which is encouraging to see. But in terms of what next, I don't know, because the reality is it hasn't had the impact even on a fraction of the scale we would like. It feels a little bit like we prepared a 3-course meal for 50 people, and somebody wandered in the kitchen and took a couple of strawberries off the dessert plate and never quite came back. And it's difficult because there aren't formalised structures really whereby we can put this through and say, okay, well, it's fully evidenced. We wholeheartedly believe that if this was adopted, we can get better outcomes, we can avoid injuries that are happening at the moment. But if we don't know either if there's something that people disagree with or whether the style of the report's unhelpful, we haven't got that feedback. So it's very difficult from a research perspective to say, what is it we do with this? And at the moment, it feels a little bit like it's just gone quiet. Let's say in terms of the practical recommendations, it has attracted, to say, a lot of interest in different areas, which was unexpected. And I think in 2 ways, just sort of wrapping up before I hand to Chrissy, the issue is nobody owns the survivor journey. And I think when you look at the NHS long-term plan, and there's some really encouraging bits in that, but the service is not aligned about the degree to which they want patients to be involved. So in the fire service at the moment, we're not even talking about that. The NHS are talking about having patient representations on policy-making decisions and forums and how they want to be patient-centric. But you can't deliver a service if everyone's doing different. And it really comes back to where we started of it only works by design if it's designed to do so. Otherwise, it is a sum of the parts and it organises itself, but it won't ever be effective. It can't be. And so I think in some ways I have some sympathy that if every organisation is conditioned to the regulations and environment in which it's operating, it has no incentive to do this sort of work. but that's a failing. So we would argue, you know, that maybe there needs to be something at the top to say you have to create somewhere that's got ownership of the full survivor journey. Either a single agency has to own it, or you create a forum, because without governance, without accountability, there is nothing to drive this, and particularly when the services are busy. I would temper that though with a case of, this is the right thing to do. You know, we've heard Danielle's story, we hear about the work Johanne and Chrissy and others are doing. On a human level, this is the right thing to do. This could be driven bottom up. If enough agencies said, we want to put this right, we want to work in a different way, government would have to listen and organise it. So I think this could be achieved. We haven't seen it in truth, to say pretty disappointingly, this have an impact in the way we can, and we don't even know why. And that's perhaps frustrating. But as I say, it's also had material benefits in different ways. But I think we'll still keep going, and we'll still argue and hopefully support the fact that we've got, if we look at things from the patient or survivor perspective, it gives us new opportunities to make sure that we do no harm, that if we make a change in one part of the system, it's not going to actually have unintended consequences elsewhere, and that we're always constantly pushing to get the best and the better outcome for everyone we serve. But at the current system and with our report, we're not entirely seeing that, to be honest.
I think quite often it's a little bit like Captain Sullenberger was saying after the crash on the Hudson, that it's not so much about who does what, or each service saying, well, this is my job, therefore I'll only do this job. It's about, you're there first, you do what that person needs. And very much the ethos of the report was about the burn service. You know, again, my view is very segmented. Yes, the patient's journey is probably the biggest one within the burn service, but actually even larger chunk of that journey is outside of us, is once they start to regain their lives and trying to reestablish their pre-injury condition and try to go back to work, try to have families, get married, live a life. And we are just a segment in that portion of their lives. And the very first leg is taken up by the fire service, by the ambulance services, by the emergency departments, which is where it's so important that we as clinicians further down the line say, did you realize that actually if you put in these few interventions, we'd have to do less, and that person's outcome would be way better. So one of the true examples were when Kent Fire Rescue Service chief wrote to me saying one of the things that they've recently done was there was a man who was assaulted with some chemical into his face, into his chest, and his dog also got injured in the same incident. And when the fire service attended, tick, it's the first time we're doing this, so the fire service attend him and do the irrigation, do the rinsing with the water. The man's main priority is, can you just check that my dog is okay? Is my dog okay? So they actually irrigated the dog and the man, saving both of their eyesight, meaning minimal injury. And this guy couldn't be happier. He sang their praises, that for him, that dog was like a family member. It was way more important than himself, his own injury. And this is what we need to understand, that when it comes to fire, we as services might say, well, that's just a minor injury, it's just a small burn on your cheek or small burn on your hand. To that person, that could be life-changing and could be absolutely everything, more meaningful than we give it credit. Or, you know, it means not a lot to us, say that they've got a laptop or a passport or their husband's photo that's deceased in the house that's burning. To them it matters, and this is where listening to that person's story, understanding it from their point of view, you take them as the leader at the scene. You take them as the leader of your team in the burn service. What is it you want? What are your priorities? And we are here to serve you. We can make it better, but only once you tell them what your priorities are, and then we can help. This is what this is about.
Trouble with my mute button there. So with that in mind, what you've just said, Chrissy, let's draw this section to a close before we go to questions and answers with Danielle. Danielle, would you tell us how you're doing now? One of the focuses of the report is about how we can work together to ensure that burn survivors thrive, not just survive. Would you be able to tell us how you're thriving?
Yes, so 11 months ago, well, first of all, I have to give it credit that being part of the Katy Piper Foundation and having other people around me with burns gave me the confidence that actually I can be loved for me, not just how I look, and even with burns and scars. So 3 years ago, I actually allowed myself to meet someone, which we actually got engaged a couple of weeks ago. So that all worked, and 11 months ago we adopted twins. So I am now a mummy. So yeah, really my life is better than I ever could have imagined it would be, and just really, really happy with life. And you know, I think when I was talking to you the other day, Jill, I said to you, you know, you have two choices in life. I have a lot of people say to me, you know, after everything you've been through, you still seem so positive. I just wouldn't be that way. And for me, I'm such a big believer of everything happens for a reason. And I know that sounds so crazy. I've got 85% full thickness burns, and I'm like, yeah, everything happens for a reason. But if I hadn't have been there and asleep in that bed where I actually slept in my parents' bed that evening, it would have been my mum in that bed. And they take your percentage of burns and your age, and they calculate your chance of survival. And with my age and my percentage of burns, I was given 1% chance of survival. My mum wouldn't have had a chance. So for me, I'm ever so grateful that it was me, and that I have my mum in the next room now to me looking after my children. Otherwise that wouldn't have been the case. And following on from that, I just think you have two choices in life. You can either give up or you have to carry on. Now, I had so many people fight to save my life. I've had over 200 hours of surgery. I've had, you know, so many people from the NHS to the Katy Piper Foundation to friends and family and everything who fought for me, and my body fought to keep me here. So giving up is just not an option for me.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I think you're incredible, and it's such an honour for us to be able to share your story today.
Oh, thanks, Jill. Thanks for having me.
So we'll move on to questions now. So just bear with me a moment while I pull them together. I can see that there's a few in the box. Okay, so the first question is for David. David, in your experience, what would you say is the biggest challenge in terms of implementing these new ideas within the fire service? Is it a reluctance from those on the ground or those from above?
That's a difficult one, and obviously it's something I've reflected on. I think it's probably both, to be honest. That for most of us in our lifetime, we've only ever seen the fire service in one model. It's a professional response model. It works a certain way. It's built up a lot of institution around it. It's governed by regulations. It has an inspectorate that looks at how it does things. Change is extraordinarily difficult. It also has 50 fire services, each with local governance. And so getting anything agreed on that basis is difficult. The National Fire Chiefs Council provides a forum to support national policy development. But it's difficult. And as I say, I think we've looked at, so you'll see that a number of services now introduce smoke hoods. I'd love to say it's because we put them in our report, and we published the report, the first report, a month before Grenfell, ironically, but it's not. It's because Grenfell recommendation said buy smoke hoods. Now that's great, but if you look at our report, that's one thing. We talk about protecting on contact, not from just smoke, but from thermal effects. And as Chrissy said, you know, small injuries can be life-changing. You burn your hand, it can lose your dexterity, it can lose your employment, you get facial burns or heat. That can be difficult for people to cope with. So I think it's difficult for us to know where you can go to get that motivation. So we put it through the National Fire Chiefs Council, and in truth, there's a resounding silence. We were told it's supported. That hasn't followed through to anything of action. I mean, Chrissy's been fantastic. She joined a number of presentations, and so we still continue to do those. And she's able to give that real personal experience of, this is what we see with burn survivors. This is what we feel could have been done. And it really brings home the human impact. When we say to people, so, how would you like your friends and family treated? And this isn't a faceless and anonymous public. This is people we know. This is happening very close. It brings it home. So we've seen some fantastic enthusiasm at ground floor level, but quite why that's not translated into, even at best, a debate about, could we do things differently? I don't know. Change in any sector is difficult, I guess. If it feels imposed, if it's not part of the strategic plan, it's come from left field, maybe it's difficult. But I'm mindful that obviously there's nobody else from the fire service here to present a different view. I have thoughts it's probably inappropriate to share them in this forum, but suffice to say, no, we haven't, 4 years on, we're still talking about what could be implemented and not fully engaged. And I think we know that the report recommendations would see better experiences and better outcomes. And but I do think, as I say, one of the structural bits is you haven't got anyone owns this. So who do you say is accountable? Who owns it? Is the lead agency? And there isn't that. So there's almost no point at which to go in and really push the pressure throughout. So in a short answer to your question, it's probably both. It's just not having enough impact on either side. There's not enough management desire and probably not enough ground floor pressure, but also the overarching environment in legislation and multi-agency working isn't designed for this sort of way of working either.
Thank you. The next question is for Chrissy. Have you approached all of the significant providers of first aid, e.g. the Red Cross, St John's Ambulance, etc., to see if they will be receptive to changing or introducing this first responder training?
We've initially approached both of those organisations actually with regards to first aid messaging and being consistent on the same page, and there's still some discordance between the two organisations. This mainly, slightly moving off topic, it's to do with the background and the research into the efficacy of first aid. The 20 minutes research comes from animal-based studies. The 10 minutes is historically from human studies, but clearly nowadays it's not ethical to burn humans in order to prove concept that 20 minutes works. Saying that, there have been a couple of studies recently from the Restore Research Group who've been fantastic and actually have done a couple of human studies who've basically concluded that we don't know why it works, but genetically we respond differently when first aid is applied, and therefore it works. So we know that 20 minutes is very effective. Unfortunately, those two first aid organisations are not on board with the 20-minute message at the moment. However, this is different globally. There in Australia, where the 20 minutes message is much stronger, the first aid and Red Cross have adopted 20 minutes as well. In Europe, not so much. In UK, definitely not. With regards to the response and being aligned with the report recommendation, we haven't approached those organisations because we feel that actually there are bigger services at play that we were trying to tackle first, but very open to discussions with anyone who feels that they would like to come on board and help us deliver this service.
Thank you. I've got another question for you and then one for Joanne. It makes sense to ask you the next one first because of the flow. Is there currently any process in place where medical teams are briefed by fire first responders once somebody has been admitted to hospital, providing that chain of information in terms of what treatment has already been given?
So I suppose as a background, most of the time, we in the burn services know very little as to what happened to our patients in the pre-hospital environment. Quite often the person is brought through on a stretcher, like Danielle said. It's never from the first transfer, it's normally the second transfer after they've already been to an emergency department. The patient comes through the burn service doors and you will get a very brief appraisal of they were in a house fire and this is your patient. So you get very little detailed information as to whether they walked out, whether they were pulled out, did they jump out? All of these kind of details are very frequently missing. Saying that, actually there was, at the same time that I met David and we started this work, within a year, I also came across another project with West Mid Fire Service that were trying to align this line of communication between the pre-hospital arena fire service and the burn center. And they were developing a fire extrication form which provided all the detail that burn services needed. And the reason, we're not just being nosy, the reason why we need to know this is so that we can deliver appropriate treatment, because we know if there were combustible plastics, for example, potentially that person has got cyanide poisoning, and we actually would deliver a life-saving measure to recover their injury and try to bring them back into kind of some sort of quality of life. So there was a real purpose to that, and that project was ongoing and very much celebrated. Now our colleagues with a good SAM app now have capacity to live stream from scene, and I'm very excited about this capacity, because actually as a burns professional, all I need to know is, what does my patient look like? What does the burn survivor look like? Show me. And then show me the scene, because I can get the idea of where they've come from and what's happened. If I get that live stream or even images from scene, it's already better. And one of the report recommendations is that if you're in somewhere where there isn't access to appliance water, fresh running water, and potentially some contaminated or even appliance water was used, we ask the fire service to collect a sample of the water and bring it to the burn service so we can test which microbes, which bacteria were harboring in that liquid. Therefore, we can treat the patient's wounds appropriately with knowledge. It makes that line of defense way stronger for us, and certainly better outcomes for the patients. So there are pockets of really good work happening, and some intimation that actually there is interest to have this, but it is so regional, and like I say, there are pockets rather than consistent standard approach, and this is what we would like. And British Burn Association support being given to our report gives us real strength and belief that actually, whilst our community, our burn specialist community, believes that this is good for our patients, I'm hoping that we'll be able to persuade all other organizations who also are in the life-saving business that quality of life is equally, if not more, important.
I'm going to break my promise to you, Johanne. I'm aware of the time. I've got two more questions that I think it would be great to cover, and then we'll wrap up. So this again is for Chrissy and or David. Someone said they found it really striking that there's no overall public body with responsibility for the whole journey of a survivor of burns, or any published guidance on inter-organisational learning. Have you had any liaison with any MPs or government organisations, because the person asking the question would like to think about how they can keep pushing the issue?
Thank you, Chair. The short answer is no, we haven't approached MPs. We did try to get to one of the parliamentary groups to present there, was unable to do so. The reality is, well, I mean, I should sort of stress, we've spent hundreds of hours of our own time and spent a lot of our own money progressing this. We are, as I hope will come across, we're passionate about this, but we are two individuals trying to make sense of how we take this forward. I think there is a debate, as saying, particularly actually when you look at the NHS long-term plan, about being patient-centric isn't just for the period of time that the NHS see the patient. It starts before, it ends after. There is something, and it probably does take an MP level intervention to look at this, because so you wouldn't run a project like this If you have a project, somebody has to own it because you need the governance. You have to coordinate the activities, otherwise you don't get the outcomes. And yet we've got some of the most important services we provide fragmented by design. We know this, we accept it, and then we say it's very difficult to work with each other, having made a system in which it makes it very difficult to work with each other. Or even for same services, as say there's 50 odd fire services, it's very difficult to get agreement. You'd lose a lot of energy talking to each other, trying to get over basic hurdles before you even think about delivering a service. So I think we would welcome any suggestions. There are some things we're trying to do to leave a positive legacy from this. But as I say, I know of other research that is worthy of debate that isn't finding a way through. We do need a structured approach to bring in new ideas, new thinking, but for all services to engage with it. And ultimately, if there is a point of view that suggests this isn't the right report, we would accept that. It's the absence of any constructive debate or response that makes it difficult. But yes, I mean, certainly from my perspective, I would say that top piece of governance, look at Danielle's story, ask where it starts, ask where it ends. We are all professionals to support Danielle. That's the bit we need to look around and make sure there's no gaps, there's no overlaps, no duplication. Nobody's doing something because they've always done that when somebody else is better placed to do it. Between us as public services, we have a huge amount of resource, technical knowledge and support, but it's for Danielle and other people like her that we need to do that, not for our own purposes. And that, I think, at the moment is missing. I don't know if Chrissy wants to add anything to that.
No, I think you've summarised it quite correctly. I mean, we have presented not only to the British Burn Association in order to get their approval, but also we have tackled the trauma network across the London South East as well, which kind of is a big overarching body, but nowhere in that process are recipients of our care are involved in this process. And we're very much, certainly in the NHS system, we're very much about shared decision making. We want to involve our patient's voice because ultimately it is their service that is being provided. We are just the way that service is delivered. It's not there for us. We are there for our burn survivors, and therefore the services are slightly skewed in a way, but I obviously don't want to criticize the services at large because they do amazing work. Look at Danielle's story, it still is a success. We're just saying that if you twist it a little bit and actually involve more burn survivors in that process, perhaps we can do it even better.
Thank you. So the final question is for you, Joanne. Somebody wants to know generally how long after injury would a survivor of burns be ready to undergo treatment that's offered by the Katy Piper Foundation?
Okay, yeah, it differs massively depending on the severity of their injury and the treatment that they've had. So everybody's at a different age. It is very individualised. Because we're now able to do the remote rehabilitation, while we will continue to do that even when we open up our residential centre again, we are able to support people quicker because they don't need to be independent and be able to self-care. They can still, we're sort of engaging with people while they're still in hospital, and the hospitals are contacting us to say, we've got a patient, we'd like to engage you now as part of their discharge so we can set up the services as they go home. Because obviously, again, patients can't get into hospital in the same way that they were able to before for their daycare and after treatment. So it is patient by patient. I hope that answers the question.
On mute again, apologies. So thank you to you all. I think we could have gone on for another hour at least. So I'm just really grateful for everything that you've said today, and hope that it's given our listeners a bit of food for thought. Thank you to everybody who has joined us today, and I hope that you found the session really insightful. We'll be sending an email out sometime over the next week with a recording of the discussion and a link to the Saving Lives report. Obviously, if you've got anything more that you want to raise with us or discuss with us, then please feel free to get in touch. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Jill.